Perspective can be a tricky enough issue when we're just looking at a simple box-like structure. But the most interest in architecture is very seldom this simple. What happens with perspective when we have not just complex architectural structures, but complex decoration on those surfaces, particularly when it becomes very rounded, very three-dimensional? This particular example is from the interior of the Louvre, but we can easily find just as ornate examples on the outside of buildings. In this video, I want to draw this particular example, but also use it as an example to talk through 5 points. The 5 things that I think of when I'm looking at and drawing ornate architectural decoration. Normally in my YouTube videos, I draw directly in pen, but I've decided that for this drawing, I'm going to use pencil to draw a light outline of the major lines. And we'll start with the first point, which is to think of perspective as distortion. If we come back to our box house, what happens is, because of the angle we're looking at this box from, it becomes distorted. It shrinks in size as it moves further away from us, both vertically and horizontally. And this is what creates what we think of as a perspective effect. Now, it affects not just the outside of the building, but all the architectural features of the building, but also, of course, architectural decoration that may be on the outside of the building or on the walls on the inside of the building. So I like to imagine how the decoration I'm going to draw would look if I were looking at it straight on rather than, as in this example, looking up from below. This is clearly a circle, and there's some sort of wreath around the circle. There's a crown with some swagged ribbons coming out from underneath it, and there are some framing decorations as well. Now, obviously we have a perspective line here, and we can use this circle to help us line up a perspective angle a bit further up, and we would probably have one something like this if it were a bit higher up. The most obvious perspective distortion is in this circular shape in the center, and it's become an ellipse. So I want to make sure I capture this elliptical shape. Now I'll draw in just a very simple pencil outline so that I can work with my ink a little more confidently. At this point, I'm only erasing lines that I've put in the wrong place that I think may be misleading for me. Before I progress this though, we'll just talk about the second point, to look at our surfaces that we're going to be putting the decoration on. Get a good sense of the three-dimensionality of the basic surfaces, not the little fancy bits on it. So this entire decoration is recessed from the wall. It sinks backwards. And if we look at the perspective lines on these 2 dots, we can see that at this side, this pattern aligns on this line. And if we look at the alignment of the dots on the pattern under here, as they move further to the left, in fact, they increase in angle. And that's a fairly subtle effect, but it's one, if we can manage to draw it in, it would be good to try and capture this shift. Now, this circle is not just a flat disc, it's a rounded structure. And therefore we see more of the surface that we're facing than of the surface that curls around from us. These are the distortions that perspective creates. And the other thing is that things become smaller as they move further away. So things at the top of this wreath will be smaller than they are at the bottom. The wreath itself is shrinking in size as it moves further away from us. So I need to make sure I don't draw it the same width all the way around, as if I were looking at it at eye level. I'll stop drawing with pencil here and I'll switch to ink. I think I'm going to use a 0.3mm pen. And before I start the ink, I'll mention my third point, which is that this ornamentation is very three-dimensional. And because it's three-dimensional, we have the three-dimensional shape of the actual decorative element, such as an orange or a peach or some grapes or a leaf, that is affected by perspective within itself, but also affected by the perspective that we looked at in point 2, which is the surface that it's on. So we have, if you like, distortion on distortion, which makes it even more important that we observe the distortion and in some way, presumably some sort of simplified way, we still represent that distortion in our drawing. I've just realized I've made a mistake. I was taking this line here as this line when in fact this line is this line. So I'm going to add to this video a demonstration of how not to get too upset with the mistakes we make, because they probably won't be nearly as obvious at the end. Possibly the biggest issue with this is that it's made me put the ends of this swagging in the wrong place. I've pulled them out a bit more than they should have been. But I'm confident it's not going to look too bad at the end. My fourth point is that when we're actually drawing the detail, it's important to catch the effect of the detail rather than the accurate representation of the detail. And that's what I've tried to do in the lines I've drawn so far and the lines I will continue to draw. I want to capture the sense of fruit and leaves and seeds that we have in this wreath. A dashed or dotted line can be a good way to represent this sort of outline in ink, because it won't really show when we finish doing the drawing. I mentioned before about being aware of the three-dimensionality of the underlying shapes, and for this wreath the three-dimensionality is this roll, this curved surface over here. So I want to particularly be aware of that. These are the elements I'll be looking at most front on, so these will be less distorted. But as I see fruits and nuts that roll over to the sides and that move further back, the distortion will increase. I also want to keep the scale correct though. And the best way to do that is simply to draw it as accurately as I can for what's here. And I find it best to start with some of the larger pieces to get a sense of the scale. Here's half our garland in place. The other thing, of course, is to draw the detail further away with a lighter touch, because that will help it look a bit further away. Oh well, I managed not to have the camera on for this bit, but I just continued it as I'd been working before. So what we're wanting to do is to, with the overall shape of this wreath, is to reflect the elliptical shape that circular shapes take, but also the fact that from down below, looking up at a twisted angle, the distortions of the wreath aren't symmetrical in any way. So I think I'll finish this by doing the crown, and then I'll move to these larger elements on each side of the wreath. My fourth point is one that I have already mentioned, which is that I'm aiming to capture the effect of the detail rather than the exactness of it. And so I want to see a contrast between these lines, which are geometric patterns, and these lines, which are organic shapes. My next point is that often with detail, it's just as helpful, rather than to draw the shapes of the detail, to draw the spaces between the detail. And this is called drawing negative space, the in-between spaces. We see this as a shape that we hope to have drawn in what we're doing. It can be also just as helpful to create shapes by drawing the shadows rather than by drawing the outlines, particularly when there's a lot of detail, because it's often the shadows being dark that register in our brain and create the sense of the shape. And the one thing I particularly want to try and make sure I do is get a sense of this mold in here, that this is the side. But first I'm going to add these sprays of buds and flowers. Another little tip with work like this is sometimes I'll actually start in the middle of a section. So if I'm drawing here, say, I might draw this part in the closest spot I feel I can put it. Or I'll draw this part before I get there, again, where I think it most helpfully sits in my drawing. Because by doing that, it helps me then, as I move the bulk of my drawing towards that point, to keep the scale as accurate as I can. The other thing I want to do with my line work is try and create a bit of separation between this garland and the flatter, but still extremely high relief, spray of flowers behind it. Notice here, I haven't really tried to draw the actual patterns here, but what I want to do is simply to represent the fact that there are patterns and that the patterns are different. The final thing with this line work is to represent this pattern here. Now it's a pretty complex pattern, and again, I want to capture the feel of it without getting bogged down in the detail of it. So what sort of compromise can I get for that? But I also want to make sure that I try and capture the underlying surface that it's on, which means the pattern will look different when I draw it here to when I draw it here. We can see the circles in the upper row pretty much straight on, but in this row on this side, as they move over, they become a little more distorted because of the perspective. They start to compress this way, and that happens even more so with the circles on the lower half. These are the things that we need to spot, and the pattern for how things are changing shape as we move around our structure. And now we'll remove the pencil. I haven't had to do this for such a long time. So here's our architectural decoration above a doorway in the Musée du Louvre. If we think of perspective as distortion, then when I look at my reference or what's in front of me, it's very helpful to try and get a picture of exactly how the distortion works, how what I see compares in shape to if I were seeing it straight on. And then particularly if there's a pattern of the way the shapes distort. It's important to look at the underlying structures that the decoration sits on and to try and create that when we put our decoration on, such as in this very rounded wreath. The ornamentation can be very 3D, and the more three-dimensional it is, the more ways in which it's going to change by the perspective to be foreshortened, both with individual parts of the decoration and across the whole scene. And one of the most helpful things I find is to try and capture the effect of the detail rather than draw an accurate representation of it, which is probably going to be impossible for us to do. And part of capturing the effect is often to focus on negative details, to draw spaces, and particularly to draw spaces that are in deep shadow. It was a lot of fun for me to use a pencil again, and I hope you're having fun with whatever you're drawing at the moment. I'll see you next time. Bye.